Welcome to today's program entitled Rodents 2, Prevention and Control. This is Thomas Cook with EPA's Center for Integrated Pest Management. I have the pleasure of being your moderator. This webinar is produced by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Center for Integrated Pest Management. To put our topic into perspective, it should be noted that rodents transmit disease pathogens via their excrement. Just one mouse can leave 100 droppings per day, resulting in millions of microparticulates that can be inhaled. An understanding of the behavior of rodents will aid pest management professionals and facility managers in many aspects of rodent control. This webinar will feature both standard and new cutting-edge technologies for tracking and monitoring rodents. Knowing where they are and where they are going and what they are doing also leads to more effective control strategies. Effective pesticide safety and IPM programs address not only the safety concerns of using pesticides, but also the causes of why pests such as rodents may enter structures. Can be a problem in homes, or why children or other building inhabitants can suffer from inhalation of millions of particles that rodents leave behind in their excrement. At this time, I would like to introduce our presenters. Our first presenter, Dr. Barbie Corrigan, is a national and international pest control expert with over 25 years of experience in urban pest management. Second presenter, Dr. Matthew Frye. Dr. Frye is an extension educator with New York State Integrated Pest Management Program at Cornell University. And finally, our third presenter, Ms. Rebecca Dmytryk, is the founding officer and board member of the Humane Wildlife Control Association and owner of the Humane Wildlife Control in Moss Landing, California. At this time, I'll turn it over. Dr. Corrigan, please take it away.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to jump right in here, but before I do, I would like to express my thanks to the EPA for the honor of being part of this webinar series on rodent IPM. And as Tom mentioned, this is part 2 of the series, and we are going to discuss the components of IPM as it relates to urban rodent management. Perhaps I'm just going to ease into this. Some people ask, well, what's it like to be a rodent consultant? What's it like to be a rodentologist out in the field? And some pretty interesting things occur from time to time, and you see some fascinating things, you see some maybe ugly things, but 28 months ago, not too long ago it seems, I was swept by a rat. I saw a rat, I followed this rat. You know, everyone knows rats and mice, and you know, they're fascinating creatures. But this rat here, as you can see, is foraging some tomatoes, which you don't see so clearly, but we all know they're there, which I'm going to show is, you know, rats and mice have whiskers, very long whiskers, and those are called vibrissae, and they're actually part of a nerve organ system that enables rodents to touch things and gather information, and they're very sophisticated in that regard. So they use those whiskers in the front of the muzzle there. You can see some of them sticking out, especially sticking out to the right, to feel things before they investigate and before they step on things, and so forth and so on. And 28 months ago, I followed a rat into an area and chased him down into a closet, and I just wanted to share with you what happened that day. It was kind of cool. But there's those vibrissae, an artist's illustration of 1 second's movement of vibrissae when they're exploring. There's been some fabulous, you know, groundbreaking research out of MIT a couple of years ago, out of Chris Moore's lab, that they were able to video those movements of these vibrissae and put them into slow motion and get to see just how they use them, you know. But for me, out in the field, you know, I have this, here's this rat you can see in the center of your screen, for example. I followed him into a dark, abandoned subway station, and that's where I was doing some investigations. And this particular rat actually stood up and stared at me, just as you see in the camera. That's my flashlight beam hitting this rat. And he took off, not too fast, but I actually followed him. And we ended up in a closet way off into the dark alley on the right there. He climbed up a wall and disappeared into a cavity. But I went in the room with him and stood still. And sure enough, his head came out of a opening right above my shoulder, there where I was standing. And of all things, he took his long vibrissae and actually swept them across my face, which for me, as a rodentologist, the first time ever in my career that's ever happened. I've had rats run on my leg and brush by me and jump over me when I'm doing my photography, but it was the first time we had this kind of cool encounter. So I don't know. I just wanted to share with everybody that when people say, "What's it like to be a biologist in the field?" Sometimes it's really great. For me, that day was maybe the equivalent of, swimming with whales or something. A lot of people would love to swim with whales and touch whales and be with whales, but I personally, I was like, this is like swimming with whales, was to be swept by a rat. So I'm going to start out with the excitement, I think, of working with rodents. I think the other speakers, they're also feel it's pretty cool to be involved with natural biology and interactions of animals. You can see here, this seminar is going to be components of rodent IPM, as Tom mentioned, and this is not a session on what is IPM, but roughly we know whether it's insects or rodents, the components of our IPM are starting with the basics, environmental issues. For rodents, sanitation, rodents smell food molecules, they follow their nose, if you will, they encounter food particles because they have to eat. And so as humans, if we keep things clean, obviously we don't want to draw them into our buildings or into our surroundings if we can help it. Secondly, of course, is, part of IPM is we want to keep them out, or obviously we don't want to let them in, right? So that's exclusion. In the first seminar that we did a couple weeks ago, Dr. Rigel from New Orleans talked about, how do we inspect and use cameras and monitors and what have you. So, and today, Matt Frye is going to talk about non-chemical approaches, best practices, and chemical rodenticides best practices. And Rebecca Dmytryk, of course, is going to talk about natural predator roles and that aspect of it. So let's jump in. Here, I'm also going to share, right this month, it just came out, National Geographic magazine has covered rats in our cities as a species and how they're attached with our city environments. And that's, you can see there, Charlie James from National Geographic, he allowed me to share these pictures and show, these are the real deal. This is a rat coming out of a sewer in a city, and you can see those vibrissae at work touching surfaces. They're actually beautiful, beautiful animals. Even though I work in rodent pest management, I have the greatest respect for rats and mice. I think they're incredible animals. Research has shown that these animals can make plans, they can make decisions, they regret making bad decisions, they go through emotional stages just as we do. And so it's, when we talk about rodent IPM, we have to keep in mind that the smartest thing we can do is, is to manage the environment so we don't attract them to our areas and then you don't want to kill them after we were the ones that attract them. So they're beautiful animals. You can see this guy's claws coming out, his paws coming out. There's germs on those feet from coming out of sewers, and from there, if they go into offices or restaurants or schools or what have you, it's not a good scenario. Just as Tom Cook started out saying, these animals can carry pathogens on their bodies and their fur, on their feet, and pass it along in excrement and urine. Let me go back here. I'm sorry. So I'm starting out with a message that, IPM involves, doing it right, of course. IPM does not mean that, we're supposed to reach for a poison right away or a trap right away or some method of killing animals right away. If these animals are around us and around us in great numbers, there's usually something we can alter to, encourage them to keep moving, move out of the area, move back to a wooded area, go seek a meadow or someplace by a river creek or something, and let them carve out their own spot and just get them away from us. We can't have them by us, obviously, for, the disease risks. They also know on wires, as you saw in that first slide, they'll sometimes get onto airplanes or trains, and you know, they can be very risky animals in that regard. They can burn down buildings by gnawing on certain wires. So it's a situation of, you know, let's not let them get a foothold. That's the key. Let's get on top of it as soon as we can within an IPM program. So as we start out, we can start with these three important corollaries for rodents. You know, and I've been teaching rodent control for over 25 years, and I'm always teaching that sanitation all by itself, if you clean up, really good research has shown with rodents, especially rats, they either leave an area or they implode, and they start controlling their own numbers. If all of a sudden there's no food, what are they going to do for protein? What are they going to do for energy? So sanitation all by itself is in fact controlling pests. Secondly, if we exclude them, that's preventing them. You know, keeping them out of our buildings as best as possible is the goal. Once they're in, they're in. If they're in a warehouse or a school, if a mouse gets in a school and gets into the ceiling, now that animal's there. Now it's excreting waste and urinating. It may have fleas, it may have lice or you know, mites, and that can cause us problems. So the point is, you know, we don't want to let them in and then put out traps or baits or sticky boards or something. You know, we want to get them before they get in, if at all possible. That's the goal. And of course, if pest exclusion is pest prevention, then, you know, pest prevention is in fact public health. So we end up in those three corollaries being the flow of things and the main point. Now, a lot can be said. You know, some people feel like, you know, is it really possible? Is it possible to be clean enough to deprive rats and mice? And the answer is, of course. You know, it is a basic premise that if there's no food, these are relatively large animals, you know, compared to insects and cockroaches and ants and so forth. So they need a considerable amount of food, and we can deny them that food through basic sanitation. We don't have to do anything crazy or way above the top or what have you, you know. But if we just, you know, do a quick, you know, tidbit on their biology, and we did this in the first series, you know, the typical house mouse that gets into anyone's kitchen or garage or school or what have you only needs 1/10 of an ounce a day, roughly 2 to 4 grams. The rat's much bigger. They're going to go anywhere from 1 all the way up to 3 ounces of food a day. So, you know, now realistically, you know, is it impossible, you know, to starve an occasional here and there mouse that gets into a suburban kitchen? And we could starve it, but, you know, with that a little bit of food, 1/10 of an ounce of, you know, a day, you know, you have to be pretty darn clean. But still, nevertheless, if you have a mouse problem and you have a lot of mice, that means there's a lot of spilled food somewhere, and usually it's among several different areas as the mouse forages about in kitchens and garages, or in, you know, the storeroom of a school or a building or an office building. So if there's a lot of mice or a lot of rats, there's plenty of food to go around. So here's our little guy, the house mouse. It's in fact the second most successful mammal on planet Earth, right there. Second most successful mammal on planet Earth, for a lot of biological reasons that we don't have time for in this webinar. But, you know, when I took this little guy's picture, you know, it was the middle of the night, and there were plenty of mice in this little warehouse, and you just watch them scurry back and forth, nibbling. They're known as nibblers, and they'll take tiny little bits of mouse and then run to a different spot and take another tiny bit of mouse. You'll also notice, for what it's worth, that's a male. You can tell in the back end there, right by its tail, you know, the scrotal sac is descended, and that tells you these animals are breeders. So it's a breeding male, you know, and usually there's close to 1-to-1 ratio of boys to girls in these rodents. So this business of cleaning, is it possible to clean? And this is a school kitchen you're looking at here. And right behind that, I'm on my belly when I took this picture, right behind that hind leg of this storage, food was stored above, is you will see that dirt there that's accumulating in the corner. Mouse comes down that wall. You can actually see its mouse trail actually coming down the wall from the storage shelves, and it was living in the ceilings, these mice, and every night they come down that same wall, over the tile, right down to the floor, and feed on whatever crumbs that the mop or the broom really couldn't get to. But the point is, if we want to keep mice out of schools and office buildings and homes and what have you, it takes detailed cleaning. We can't leave spots like that. There's enough, accumulated flour and tidbits of cereal and what have you in that one corner there to feed a whole family of mice for the entire week. So, it doesn't take much. So can we keep clean enough? Yes, we can, but it does require somebody's knee pads or whatever, getting on their belly and digging it out with a tool. So then we put that sanitation in with the combination of clutter. And now we end up with what I'm going to call the perfect storm when people have mouse problems inside buildings. If you take mice and you use the typical human cardboard, we love cardboard, we need cardboard boxes in humans are, what we do. But you put those together within 100 feet of some type of food, and you end up with mice taking off in pretty good numbers right away. Here's the very typical scenario. This is a storage area below a food serving establishment. And the reason I took this picture is, they had chronic ongoing problems with mice, and they kept firing one pest control professional after the other, claiming none of them could get it done. And the fact of the matter is, all those boxes you see up there, in fact, 8411 box was loaded with mice. But if you go further down to the other 8, you see that box is loaded with mice. So, and on it went with this particular basement. And so the answer was not poisons or traps or glue boards being put around the wall in beautiful spacings of every 25 feet. The answer was a very careful cleanup and organizing of all those boxes that were just sitting there month after month. All the mouse holes, by the way, are on the back end and the dark side, and that's how the mice do it. They'll come and go from those boxes, you'll never even realize it. So clutter, sanitation, detailed sanitation is the way to go with these animals. That one box there is in an office building. They called me in to solve an unsolvable mouse problem, they said, and that one box right there, when I took it down and, surrounded it, mice came running out all over. And those same mice every night were visiting the office employees. This is one of those employees. She's showing me, all the mouse turds every single day. She has to clean them up, and there's mouse churn on papers and on desks. That's not a healthy scenario to have a house mouse moving around, leaving feces and urine. Those feces and fecal pellets and urine can carry and have been shown to carry pathogens. So we have to keep them out of our living and working environments. Even here, I took this picture. It looks very clean. This is the break room of that office area. Everything looks tidy and beautiful. No one have any hesitation whatsoever of eating in that break room. However, on that countertop and around the edge of that countertop and off to the side by the refrigerators, I'm going to show you, if you blacklight that, it will glow with mouse urine every single night. They're foraging about in those areas. So the point is, that looks great because everything's within reach for a mop or a broom. But you pull out the refrigerator and there you have it. The mice are living within the refrigerator, and they'll get into the stoves and the refrigerators. They'll live within the insulated walls. You'll never even realize it. And that's all mouse urine, all mouse feces, all mouse damage through refrigerator walls with insulation. And all of that is being blown out by the compressor motors below that refrigerator into the environment where people are making food, sitting, having food, and what have you. And when that occurs, of course, we're inhaling particulate matter, as Tom mentioned, could be inhaling viruses and whatnot. So sanitation is the key. It starts out with sanitation. This is not solved necessarily going straight for putting out some bait or snap traps or glue boards. It is solved by cleaning up, denying these animals as much as possible. And then, as Dr. Frye is going to discuss, when we do have to use tools, we use them in the best practices. So we have the rats, of course, here's our buddy that I showed when first starting out, this particular rat. And they can be a different ball game in terms of sanitation because it's a lot of food, as I mentioned. Here we have an animal 1 to 3 ounces every single day. So if you have just one family of 12 rats, which is a typical rat family, there's 5 to 7 pounds of food going down every single week. So it's a situation where, we have to get control of that. And the bottom line, when people see a lot of rats, sometimes they ask me, well, what's the best poison? What's the best trap? And I'm like, I start out and say, look, if there's a lot of rats, someplace pretty close by, there's a very identifiable food issue. Let's identify that first. Let's see what it is, and then let's address it. With rats, when it's an infestation, it's typically they're using our refuse, and commercial dumpsters, litter baskets, garbage cans in suburbia and areas of cities in the backyards, for example. Sometimes people have dogs and dog houses and chickens. Someone puts in chickens, you're almost guaranteed you are going to be drawing in rats. Rats smell chickens from, seems like, forever away, So, but in general, once there's a rat problem, there's usually a garbage problem, usually. All right. And so for me, it's all about teaching trashology, and even the basics. That's why I call it trashology 101. For example, if we look, this is a school. I'm not picking on schools. I'm not picking on office buildings or anybody. I'm just saying here's a school that was very adamant about making sure nobody was applying any pesticides in the other sides of those doors. But yet, the way they were doing their dumpsters, which were not correct, they were drawing all these pests to the door zone, and then, saying, whatever you do, no pesticides on the inside. We don't want to do that, which is terrific. But it's a situation where, well, let's not draw them to your school dock to begin with. Let's do the dumpster correctly with some kindergarten level dumpsterology of how to use the dumpster and making sure you're doing it correctly. Here's a park, obviously, and I took this picture because I was walking around this park investigating the really serious rat problem, as you can see right there. And as I'm walking around, I'm caving into rat world. All those burrows would just cave in under my weight, and rats were running. But how did we get to this many rats? There's plenty of food to go around, and in fact, you didn't have to look nearby. It was just ordinary city litter baskets. And again, here's another great photograph by Charlie Hamilton James from National Geo, which is out this month. This photograph's there. You can see at night, everybody goes home. The litter baskets aren't going to be collected till morning, and all night long, rats are gorging from these park litter baskets and corner litter baskets, and they're going to breed forever with that kind of a ad-lib food, protein for as long as it goes. So then we switch over to, well, let's keep them out. And here again, we have the question, is it possible to exclude rats and mice from the typical urban building? And, schools, restaurants, office buildings. And here again, the answer is yes, it is. But, it's a case where the workmanship, just like the detailed cleaning, has to be done correctly. And if it's done partially, like the cleaning you saw there in the corner, if someone plugs up a hole but doesn't plug it up correctly, then in they come. So here it is, that exact scene you just saw with a cartoon, now put to reality. These aren't fake pictures. I take these pictures when I do my surveys, and we can see here the rats and the mice just have no problem. As well, ants, cockroaches, occasional invaders, anybody wants to come in through that. Just, it's improper work, sloppy work, and the rodents take advantage. In fact, they're designed with pointed muzzles. They're designed to shove those muzzles into cracks and crevices, small holes, by their very design. When you look at this mammal, that's the shape. And those muzzles get pushed in, and if they get to certain reaction, they keep going forth or they'll back it out. Here's a mouse coming through a hole and using the vibrissae to figure out whether or not it can make it or not. So, and this is what they've been doing forever, long before buildings. Rats and mice trying to hide from hawks and owls that Rebecca's going to talk about, for example. They need harborage, and can they fit in harborage? So they have to make those decisions with those pointed muscles as to whether or not it's going to go. So, the point of the matter is, if you're on this webinar, chances you're you're in this area where you yourself have urban rodents, you deal with them, you manage them, or you're trying to, keep them out and so forth. But if you're in an area where you leave a door open, or if it doesn't have the right pest proofing at the base, any kinds of openings in walls and what have you, these rodents are going to find their way in following warm air currents and food molecules. That's what they do. So without belaboring the point, of course, here is actually, I would say, the typical door of the typical urban building. We do a horrible job on protecting our doors. And if you have any doubt about that, just go on a walkabout of your own town, and especially commercial areas, and just, instead of looking at the door from the handle area, look at the base, and you'll see just how many people pay no attention whatsoever to keeping rodents out through the threshold areas. In fact, here it is. I took this picture while I was lying on the floor of like one of the biggest train stations in the United States, and they were just coming in one after the other into these restaurants at this train station. And, we're like, this would all stop if you would just do your doors correctly. But they thought I was, exaggerating that how small a hole a mouse can get through, which is only, 6 millimeters when they get through there. In fact, you can measure this, and this is out of my own textbook, but, it's just 6 millimeters, a quarter of an inch, and the mouse is in. They cannot flatten out their body completely. That's a myth. Rats cannot flatten out their body, either. But if they can get that skull through, the rest of the body will follow. So here's another picture I took of rodents coming through below a door, and once they feel that proper fit from the vibrissae on top of their head, then it's go. So, here we have a typical scenario as I wrap up here, and in exclusion, and it's people put up weather strips and vinyl strips thinking they will keep rats and mice out. But rats and mice are called rodents because rodent means to gnaw, G-N-A-W, and that's their tools. And they've been gnawing into trees and logs and, chipping away at things to get into them forever, as I mentioned earlier. And so a piece of vinyl is not going to keep out a rodent on a door. They're going to, as you see here, they're going to chew right through that. All that grease you see, the brown grease, is from them squeezing their body down as they get to it and they enter in. So a take-home message for everyone here, especially if there's maintenance professionals on this webinar, anyone that does any work in repairing things, weather stripping will never keep rodents out of a building. You have to pest-proof a door, not weather strip a door, right? They'll go right through. And in fact, here's heavy-duty vinyl. This is a maintenance worker in a food plant said, well, this is heavy duty. I can't imagine a rodent getting through there. And I took this picture the very next day after stressing, no, you can't use vinyl. And here's the rat teeth right in that vinyl. It must have taken that rat all of 5 minutes to get through there. So it has to be done correctly. So the fact of the matter is, a large percentage of human doors that we look at and we close them up for the night, and we lock them, and we say that door is closed and locked. It's actually wide open to rodents 24/7, 365. Here's one of those examples. This big warehouse full of breakfast cereal, and you can see the door says, this door must be kept closed, in yellow above. It must be kept closed. Well, it is closed to human beings and raccoons, I guess, and deer. But on the bottom right there, every single night, day in, day out, until they put the proper rodent proofing below that door, it's a totally open door. So it's an open to a closed door. And sure enough, they were coming in there pretty regularly. So here's a double door on actually museum, a famous museum, and mice chew through the space between the two doors. That's called an astragal space. And you can see the tooth marks there, and the animal simply coming in at will. And in this case, a mouse got into the storage room of some very, very expensive art, and sure enough, gnawed into a piece of canvas and changed the whole disposition of that piece of art completely. So, we can't afford in some cases to, weather strip a door and call it quits. This is Dr. Matt Frye. You're going to hear Matt in just a couple of minutes from now. Matt and I were out looking at doors in a city, and Matt is pointing to a Astrogal space of a very upscale office building in a big city, and he's basically all night long the rodents come and go from there. It is. That's the mouse point of view. In fact, I think it's even a rat point of view in this particular case. But fancy doors get locked up every single night to a beautiful building, yet the mice come and go at will. So, sorry, let me just, because so there's also brushes out, there's different types of exclusion materials out there, but just like detail cleaning and paying attention to details of box and what have you, if we're going to keep rodents out of doors, we want to make sure that we use the right materials. So this is a brush, and it will keep mice out, but it will not keep rats out. And what you're looking at here is that's the work of a rat in just 15, 20 minutes, because I monitored this particular door, and they will go through it very quickly, and almost as if they had a ruler. They'll just plant their feet, dig into the box, and then use their incisors to go through and cut a hole right through it. There's technology out here, right here, and there's a company in Chicago called Excluder. They really do rodent proofing right. I'm not here to endorse anything or anybody. I'm just saying this technology gets the job done for Astrogal spaces, threshold spaces, and as far as I know, they're the ones that get the job done most thoroughly, right? And so that technology exists. You don't have to look too far to find it. It's out there. So I do want to mention there's escutcheon plates that are equally important as quality door sweeps. I think everyone realizes what a escutcheon plate is, but as those pipes below that sink go into the wall, those holes that are drilled to put those pipes into the wall, they have to be sealed off. And you can even see, for example, there's a mouse trap there because that pipe was not sealed off correctly. But that's the wall chase. The pipes go in, they form this chase where there's hot water, there's cold water, there's drain pipe right there. And if that connection is not sealed, you'll have rats living there, mice living there, forward flies, cockroaches. It'll become a pest wall. So that's not the answer. This is what many homeowners will do, and sometimes superintendents of apartment buildings. They'll just stuff a piece of steel wool in there and call it a day, and that will be pushed out or rust out or fall out very quickly. So there's the escutcheon plate. That's a green arrow. That's my arrow, just showing, the plate has to be sealed up against the pipe where it enters the wall. So that wall void right there is denied. So I pull that plate back, and we can see just what's behind that. And finally, human beings were famous for, using quick foams out of a spray can, as if, that takes care of it. Spray foams out of a can are not sealants. They are fillers for big holes, but they're not meant to seal anything out in terms of rats and mice. And in fact, they're the worst choice, quite frankly. I just took this picture 3 weeks ago, I think, when I was out in the field working in a food distribution warehouse. And they were trying to keep the mice from getting into the food distribution house, which they constantly were doing over and over again. So they would foam up every single crack they could find, and the mice would chew right through it again. So you want to make sure anything that's sealed is they cannot get those teeth into any crevice to dig it out. Once they get an edge to dig out a crevice, it goes from there. So I'm going to stop here. I'm stopping with a slide of the bottom of the door, and this is, I could actually write in that mouse sebum and the rat sebums, the body, the grease off their bodies. And so I just thought I'd leave them a note to let them at least know I stopped by to look at our horrible work on the door and why they were coming and going. So thank you for the opportunity to participate today. Again, it was an honor to be here, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. Bobby Corrigan. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Frye. Dr. Frye, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. So I'm gonna jump right in also, and on the heels of Bobby, just want to say that I think his message is probably the most important for both sessions of this webinar, because if we take our time to impose proper sanitation and remove those food sources and have exclusion to keep pests out, we won't have to manage them in the ways that I'm going to describe and that Rebecca will describe. So having that be your main emphasis, if the thing you take away from today is that I need to improve my sanitation and exclusion, then we have taught you something. So my few slides here will talk about implementing a control strategy once rodents get inside. And this is a huge topic, a topic all unto itself, but I'll try and cover just a few key points and maybe a few tips to help you along the way. If we're placing devices in runways or areas where we know that rodents are frequently moving back and forth from a harborage to a food site, we may choose to use the firm setting that's a little bit more difficult to engage the paddle. This is used because as a rodent is running over that device, it has to fully commit to stepping on that paddle before the trap is engaged and the kill bar will hit the animal. On the opposite side, the sensitive setting, if we are using a trap for a baiting program, this sensitive setting will deploy the trap with even the slightest touch to that paddle. And so we don't need that same level of commitment to capture the rodent. Some other important features of this trap are the bait tray. You see here that it is a very small area on that paddle itself. And this is important because in reality, when we're baiting for mice, which is this trap's design, we want to only use enough bait to fill that bait tray. If we use too much bait on a device such as this, we can actually reduce the efficacy and functionality of the trap. Some other things to consider, as we mentioned, we want to place devices in runways. We don't want to overbait. And in the center here, we see baiting with peanut butter or another semi-solid substance from the back of the trap. This too can actually lead to enhanced engagement by the rodent. If there's nuts or something that they have to pull, as they try to interact with that trap, they will be much more likely to be captured. Some other tips are what we consider for the bait. That's one of the primary questions that we receive is what is the best type of bait to use on a mouse or rat trap? Essentially, this is highly variable and it depends on the population where we are trapping. In the bottom left, we see a Snickers bar that has been chewed into by a mouse. If a rodent is currently feeding on a food source that's available, that is the type of food that we want to use on our traps. They're already comfortable with it. They recognize the smell. Ideally, we'll put a device in a location near where that product has been, which will enhance our capture rate. If we don't have anything that's currently being fed on, things like peanut butter are a standard that are used for mice and rats as well. There are some situations, however, where we can't use peanut butter. So if we're concerned about allergies in a home, or if there are other pests present. So the image on the bottom right shows ants feeding on some peanut butter on that trap. We may also see cockroaches feeding on snap traps. And so to avoid this, we can use nesting materials such as dental floss or string, which is the image on the top left. And we can enhance the attractiveness of these nesting materials by dipping that in vanilla extract or actually bacon grease. We need to remember that rodents are not always active at the floor level. This image represents a rodent runway above our heads on pipes. And even though droppings were found at the floor level, a 360-degree inspection was conducted and found that the rodents were running on this pipe. So if we're to effectively manage this population, we need to place the device where the rodents are active. There are a number of trap types that are probably better suited to this type of setting, but it's possible to use a standard snap trap with a wire tie as seen here. a zip tie or string to attach it to vertical or horizontal surfaces. It's really important if we are placing traps above heads to make sure that we're affixing it to that surface. We don't want to have a trap that has a dead rodent on it falling off and landing on the surface below, or just the trap being engaged and landing on someone. There are additional recommendations for utilizing snap traps to enhance their efficacy. One of them is to make sure that we place runway traps side by side. If we're trapping in an area such as a sill plate where we know that rodents are using it to run back and forth from harborage to feeding sites, and we place 2 traps, if a rodent detects that trap and jumps to avoid it, they'll land on the second device. Additionally, we want to make sure that we are utilizing enough traps. One of the limitations that we observe is that too few devices are being deployed in a location that is dealing with an infestation. Based on some of the work in textbooks, it's recommended that 6 traps be used for a single mouse. And so when we're dealing with an infestation, we need to scale up the number of devices that we have to effectively manage the population and not just the individuals. When we're using traps to interact with rats, we need to make sure that we are pre-baiting. This is a technique that's used to overcome their shyness of new items in their environment. So in this case, we would use a trap on the left that is not set, and we add bait for maybe a week or more to see that the rodent is taking that bait at least 3 times. Once the rat is comfortable at removing the bait and visiting that device, then we engage the trap to have a much higher success rate of catching that rat. Now, some additional considerations for rat management is the use of traps multiple times in a control strategy. The image on the left shows a trap that has successfully captured a rat, and the question is, will subsequent rats avoid this trap? The answer would be no. Rats are not deterred by the smell of dead rodents. They may actually feed on carcasses of other rats. They are not deterred by the smell of people, but they may be deterred by certain smells such as nicotine or cigarette smoke. The image on the right is a slightly different scenario where a rat has visited this bait station, has encountered a T-Rex trap, and actually had its paw stuck in the trap. It removed its paw either by chewing or pulling out of that trap, and so has had a very negative interaction with this device. The question here is, will this rat avoid subsequent traps that look like this? And you bet. They are very cautious of new things to begin with, but after having a negative experience, we would have to completely change our approach to managing this rat in that population. For some additional tutorials on using snap traps, we have 2 Spark videos on YouTube. They can be found on the New York State IPM program's website. The first is how to set a trap and talks about the different ways of engaging that paddle and what types of traps to use. And then the second one talks about tips for using those traps in an effective control strategy. Now, as far as the other management strategies go, the first one I'll discuss is glue traps. I won't focus too much on this for rodent control because as far as captures go, we tend to see that only juvenile animals are trapped on that glue surface. And the reason for this is that adult rodents have sensory hairs that allow them to detect changes in texture. And this is an adaptation to help them avoid being trapped in surfaces like mud where a predator can then feed upon them. So if we're using glue traps, we can successfully harvest juvenile animals, but are not likely to interact with those breeding animals. So our impact on the entire population is likely to be low. There's also issues and concerns about the humaneness of these traps for mammals, but I will say that these glue traps are essential for use in monitoring insect populations and in managing some of their numbers. Probably the most commonly used type of rodent management strategy is the application of rodenticides, especially by the professional pest management industry. Even visiting big box stores one of the most common items on the shelf for rodent management are rodenticides. There's a variety of different types of rodenticides that are available. We have anticoagulants that cause internal bleeding in rodents by preventing the blood from clotting. These are classified into two main groups. The first generation, which requires multiple doses, multiple feedings on that bait to have a lethal effect, whereas the second generation anticoagulants require only a single dose, after which the rodent tends to succumb. There are advantages to this second generation because it can avoid some of the behavioral resistance. There are non-anticoagulant rodenticides as well. This includes zinc phosphide, bromethalin, and cholecalciferol. Each of these have a different mode of action for killing rodents and can be used in some of the same environments. For the different types of rodenticides and the different active ingredients, there are a number of different formulations. These may come in hard blocks, in soft packs, pellet form, grain form, meal, etc. So ideally, selecting the type of rodenticide that we use in an account would be based on our inspection and our interpretation of what the current food source is. However, in many cases, pest professionals simply select the type of bait that they like and use it for all accounts. This has some advantages and disadvantages in terms of acceptability by the rodent population, but in general seems to be effective. In terms of rodenticides, there are some major concerns that we face. The first is translocation, where bait is moved from the location it was placed to a non-target location. This can be in an area that exposes people to it or secondary predators or other animals. So this is one of the concerns and one of the reasons that there have been increasing standards and regulations over the use of rodenticides. The second is secondary poisoning, where animals such as rodents, rats, and mice that have fed on the bait are then preyed upon by secondary animals such as birds of prey. And these secondary animals succumb to the pesticide just as the rodent would. So these concerns are probably the greater reason that there's new introduction of legislation in states such as California to limit the use of rodenticides. So while rodenticides are an effective tool, there are certainly considerations that we must keep in mind when we deploy them as a control strategy. I'd like to move on to monitoring and record keeping. Monitoring is an essential tool in rodent management because it keeps track of what happened in the interval between our inspections. It also exploits the cryptic behavior of pests such as rodents, which are primarily active during the times when people are not present. So it's a record of that exposure and what's happening when we're not there. I like to use pictures such as this rodent to emphasize the point that there is valuable information that we can obtain with every capture that we have on a trap or in another device. And we've created this monitoring log to obtain some of that information to help with your interpretation. This Form 2 is available from the IPM program's website, and it captures information such as the number of rodents that were in a device, the species present, the age of the rodent, the sex, number of droppings, and then any other observations in terms of the direction it was moving, if the rodent has fed upon rodenticide, and other considerations. The information collected in this form will help you determine your next approach to the rodent management problem. So some of the insights that we can gain from monitoring tell us about pest movement, their directionality, and the source. This particular mouse was captured in a basement, and traps were set up in a grid pattern on the sill of this entire space. Over time, the location of those captures were tracked, and it was efficient in determining where the entry point was to that basement from the exterior. Traps such as this can also be used to help determine bait preferences if we have traps that are utilizing different types of bait. We can also use our devices interpretively to figure out what pest is actually present. In this case, this was an account where the customer had complained to the pest professional that rats were observed in a hallway. So rat traps were deployed, but kept being triggered without any catches. When we take a closer look, we can see that the tooth impressions left by this rodent's feeding were 2 millimeters. And this would tell us that the target animal that's actually feeding on this bait is a mouse and not a rat. So we can gain some insights about the rodent that's present, what device we need to deploy, just based on interpreting some of the evidence that's left from our monitors. We can also see in the image on the left that we've captured a piece of tail on that rat snap trap. So these devices do not deploy as quickly as the device that would capture a mouse. It also may be informative for us to determine what sex of the rodent we have captured. Bobby discussed earlier being able to see the descended scrotal sac of males. We can also determine the difference based on the distance from the anus to the genitals. When it's a short distance, that represents a female, and when it's a larger distance, that represents a male. And so you can see that here, where we have on the left a female and on the right a male. Now, how does this inform our management plan? Well, we know in the case of mice, for example, that females can complete their maturity to a sexually reproductive adult in 35 to 60 days. If in our management program we are trapping but not capturing those reproductive females, only capturing juveniles and adult males, then we know that we may need to increase our service frequency or change our approach so that we capture the breeding animals. We can also use our bait stations as monitors as well. So this bait station, as you can see, has been heavily fed upon by mice in this case, so we can identify the species present by the size of the droppings. I can also interpret from this picture alone that I have a mixed age population of rodents because some of these droppings are large and others are very small. So I have adults and juveniles, they're reproducing, they're mice. I can also tell that because none of these droppings have the characteristic color of the rodenticide bait that's being used, that this is either a new infestation or that this bait station hasn't had bait in a long time. So I can interpret a lot about the situation and determine my next steps just based on the evidence that's left in my monitoring device. We've talked about the importance of droppings and how they can be used in a management program in terms of interpretation. One of the most important interpretations is presence or absence of that rodent population. If we remove droppings at the end of our service and we come back and there's new droppings, it's an indicator that we haven't effectively eliminated our population of rodents. Importantly, if we're going to remove droppings, we should follow the guidelines presented by the CDC. You can see the link below to safely eliminate those droppings without exposing ourselves to pathogens. Some of the monitoring outcomes that we can achieve by really documenting the evidence that we find, whether it's trap catch, bait take, or pest evidence, is that we can hone our inspection and focus our efforts during future visits. So this is true if you're a homeowner and you're dealing with a pest problem, or if you are a professional pest management company hired to solve a problem. This image would represent a condominium complex, and we can see that the colored trapezoids are indicative of bait stations. The red and orange indicate heavy activity and moderate activity, whereas green would represent no activity. Just by looking at this monitoring information, I realized that I would need to focus my inspection and eradication efforts where there's more activity on the bait station. Unfortunately, this is often overlooked, and all stations are treated equally in a management program. So we really need to look at that evidence and interpret it to determine how we can best approach rodent management. Real briefly, I wanted to mention two items that have been in the media. The first is the use of cats for rodent control, and you can see in my title here, no. The reason is that first and foremost, there's no evidence that this works besides testimonies. And by testimonies, I mean reports that people in communities that are using feral animals see fewer cats. Scientifically, that is not enough evidence to support using a certain technique. This could actually be due to crypsis, where the rodents become more cryptic and hiding because of the presence of predators, or they're pushed to an adjoining neighborhood, which means that it hasn't been a successful management strategy. Additional reasons for not using cats is that feral animals themselves can become pests. Their populations can expand to the point where the animals are suffering due to lack of food availability. Birds, in particular songbirds, are negatively impacted by the presence of feral cats, and it's estimated that 1.3 to 4 million birds are killed annually by these animals. And importantly for human health, feral populations of cats will defecate in litter boxes, city and county parks, and those feces can contain parasites and pathogens that can affect human health. So cats for rodent control is a no. On the other hand, another media item is the dry ice for rats, and this one I would say yes. There's good evidence that this technique works when it's done according to the label. Rodents will die in the burrow from a lack of oxygen, and this will actually confine dead animals to that space that is underground, presumably preventing the transfer of pathogens to people as well as movement of ectoparasites. And so my last point that I'd like to make is a consideration of how do we define success in rodent management. Many professionals may look at this image on the right and think that this is success because we've harvested a huge number of rodents from a home. But in fact, my interpretation is that high trap capture is failed prevention. This is an opportunity for us to prevent problems from occurring instead of harvesting off the problem that comes inside. And so I'd like us to think about changing our perspective on rodent management to really thinking about the entire population and not just the single battles that we win when we capture an individual rodent. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Thomas. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Frye. Next up, we'll hear from Ms. Dmytryk. Rebecca.
Yes, hi, good morning, good afternoon. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to give this presentation here. Over the last decade, I've focused on developing solutions to human-wildlife conflicts that are sound, sustainable, ethical, and humane. And so the use of barn owls as a way to control rodent populations was a strategy we really honed in on. As far as we can tell, the utilitarian use of barn owls started back in the 1970s and early 80s in the Middle East, when it became clear that the rodenticides they were using were, yes, killing rodents, but they were also killing the natural predators, the predatory birds. Through collaboration between conservationists and farmers, they created this wonderful National Barn Owl Project that now has over 4,000 established nesting boxes. In the United States, the use of barn owls is growing in popularity both in agricultural areas and suburban settings as well, even in residential areas. Barn owls, they are built to prey on nocturnal rodents. They can locate prey even in total darkness, and their vision is really good, but it's their hearing that's exceptional. A barn owl's ear openings are just behind the eyes, and they're placed asymmetrically. One is just higher than the other, and interestingly, one is more forward than the other. So they can really hone in on their prey even in total darkness. They are also virtually silent when they fly. They have structures on their feathers that allow them to be totally silent. They're not too big. Our American barn owl is the largest of the subspecies, 16 inches tall by about 48 inch wingspan. Even so, when you take off all the feathers, there's not much to them. They weigh about a pound. They're not going to be any danger to a small dog or cat. The barn owls mostly prey then on small rodents. So that's going to include the rats, mice, voles, gophers, and the occasional mole and small rabbits, the baby bunnies. Barn owls follow the food source, so you won't find them in sparse deserts or areas that get too deep with snow. They mostly inhabit regions that are below 4,000 feet that have the required habitat, which is mostly going to be open grasslands and fields. That's where they want to hunt. So in an urbanized area or agricultural area, it'll be farm fields, golf courses, sports fields, parks, cemeteries. Barn owls aren't picky about their prey, so they're going to shift their diet to whatever's prevalent, reducing and controlling that prevalent rodent population. So that's really good when we're using them to control rodents. They're relatively sedentary, which means a pair of barn owls might remain in one area their entire lives. They're not that territorial, which means you can have a number of barn owl families on a single property. They hunt close to home, within about a half mile to about 2.5 miles. So it makes them really good, a good investment for both agricultural and residential uses. Barn owls are cavity nesters. They like to have a sheltered place to call home. And they're not too picky. It's pretty easy to get them to take to a man-made structure like this, a barn owl nest box. If you build it, they will come. Our barn owls will produce about 1 or 2 clutches in a year, usually with just one, with about 4 to 6 eggs on average. But we have a couple of boxes right now, one with 9 eggs and another with 7. It's interesting because the barn owl hen will lay 1 egg about every other day, but the first egg, when the first egg comes, she starts incubating them, which means you'll have chicks that are hatched asynchronistically. You'll have one that's a little tiny guy, and then you'll have one that might be a week or so old. That's called asynchronous hatching. It takes about 30 days for the babies to hatch. This is a picture of from the Barn Owl Trust that shows the stages of development. It takes about 60 days before the little babies are ready to fly. But during that time, they're eating the equivalent of about 12 mice per night each. So that'll do a lot of damage to your local rodent population. As the young owls get more feisty as they grow up, the parents stop spending time in the box during the day. They'll go roost somewhere else. But at night, the babies will get really active and they'll need room in their box to flutter around and pretend to catch prey. So that's really important that the owl box that you provide them is large enough to hold a large brood and allow them to flutter around at night inside the box. Unfortunately, this is a picture of a variety of owl boxes that are available on the internet. It starts with the smallest one that's 15 inches by 18. That's way too small. And at the other end, you'll see our owl box is really big, 36 wide by 22 by 24 high. And there's reason for that. Here is our box and the dimensions. There are a couple of really essential things. Overall size, of course, is important. It's got to be at least 29 inches by 24 by 24. That's the minimum for any box. The placement of the entry hole must be at least 16 inches from the floor. This is really important because this is going to prevent the babies from either falling out, jumping out, or being pushed out when they're at the door waiting for the parents to bring them food. Here is a picture of, let me go back one slide, I'm going to see if that works. Another critical thing we've learned in the last year is 2 inches from the top. So whatever height your box is, make sure that the hole is at least 16 inches from the floor. And if you can, 2 inches from the top, because this is what can happen. When the babies come out for the first time, let me see if I can get this to play. Okay, here we go. So that's a young fledgling. He just came out of the box and he's grabbing his way back in. It'll repeat in a second. See, he's grabbing the rim of the entry hole and he's able to pull himself back in. So that's something we learned this year, adding that to our standards. Also, on the outside and inside of the box, you want to provide some grooves, just light grooves for the barn owls to be able to grip both the inside and outside. As far as ventilation, we put about a 1-inch gap at the top of the side that's farthest from the hole, the entry hole. The nest box has drainage holes at the bottom, about 1/2-inch holes, maybe 12 or so. The box is mounted, ours are mounted on 6x6 treated lumber posts, and we want to face them, the owl box, the entry hole, we want to face it away from prevailing winds and east if possible. Okay, ideally the box should be situated near a large tree facing an open area. They don't like to have things obstructing their entry. They like to swoop in. In places where you have a lot of sunshine and heat, if it's going to be in direct sun, it should be painted a light color. And then where you have them in, the temperatures are above 85 degrees for an extended period of time and they are in the sun, you'll want to put something on called a sun shield. It's just an extra piece of plywood on the two sides, the top and 1 or 2 sides that are getting the sun the most. That's going to protect them. You'll also want to put a little bit more ventilation, maybe a couple holes towards the bottom for added ventilation. Every site is going to be specifically, have its own characteristics, so we're happy to consult if you'd like. Boxes can be installed on buildings, on trees, but we typically put them on tall posts. We use a 20-foot post, 5 in the ground, so that means a 15-foot tall 6x6. Sometimes we use 8x8 lumber. This is my husband putting up one of the owl boxes, and he's designed a system where he uses an electric winch to haul the box up there. Again, we can consult you if you're going to be installing your own. Before inviting a family of owls to your community, consider the possible risks to the health and welfare of these owls. Owls like to land on prominent places near their nest, so make sure there are no power lines or other dangerous things they can land on. And it's also important to try and eliminate the use of anticoagulant rodenticides from the area. As you heard the other speakers talking about this, it's a really big problem with our predator animals getting poisoned by eating exposed rodents. After eating the bait, rodents live for another couple of days and they become weak, and they're usually found outside of their homes, and that's where they get eaten by predators. For decades, the risk of secondary poisoning has been known, and as they mentioned also, there's changes being proposed in California especially to ban or at least restrict the use of some of these things because it's damaging our predator populations. This is a diagram showing you how the poison goes from where it's placed at a house and then it gets into the prey animals and then eaten by the predators. Here's an example of a restaurant. It's in Moss Landing, California, and it did away with the use of rodenticides, and they actually brought in a barn owl box to help control their rodent populations. And here's the picture of the owner and the owl box. Here is an image of what goes on in the box. She actually had a camera installed. Let's see if this will play. I mean, that's just adorable. And she got great publicity. She has people coming into the restaurants just to dine with the owls. She's got, instead of a big screen with sports, she's got a big screen TV showing the inside of the owl box. Quite fun. As for maintenance of the boxes, they should be cleaned out once a year in the winter months after the young have dispersed. You'll want to check the box, preferably in the evening time, to see if there's an owl in it so you don't disturb the owl. We use a painter's pole, extended painter's pole with a cell phone on the end of it to peek inside. As for how effective owls are at controlling rodent pests, studies have shown a 46% decrease in rodents where owls have been introduced. So using barn owls to help control rodents is a win-win. It provides the owls with a home, and they provide us with rodent extermination. And who wouldn't want to share their property with a family of owls?